Everyone, to our webinar, APS at 125. This is the fourth of our series of webinar sessions. I'm Bruce Hunt. I'm a professor of history at the University of Texas at Austin, and I'm currently the chair of the APS Forum on the history and philosophy of physics. We're very happy today to welcome Sarah Bridger, who's an associate professor of history at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and the author, what most relevantly for our topic today, the author of Scientists at War, The Ethics of Cold War Weapons Research, which was published in 2015 and won the Society for U.S. Intellectual History's annual book award. With that, I will turn it over to Sarah to begin her presentation. She'll speak for probably roughly 40 minutes. Then we'll take questions and have discussion. And I'll say more about that later, but you can either raise your hand virtually there or enter a question on the chat. So hand it over to Sarah.
Great, thank you so much. So give me a moment just to set up my screen share here. All right, hopefully everyone can see that.
Yeah, looks good.
Great. Oops. Hold on just a minute. Sorry about that. Okay. All right. Thank you so much for having me today. And thank you especially to Holly and Bruce and to Joe. It's really an honor to be part of this webinar series. I'm going to start my talk today in the middle of the Cold War era, that is, actually in a moment of hot war, the war in Vietnam. Back in the late 1960s, I would say, then as now, the American Physical Society was one of the most prestigious professional scientist societies in the United States. Its membership ranged from rising stars of graduate schools to Nobel laureates to grizzled Manhattan Project veterans. And back in December of 1967, a young Berkeley physicist named Charles Schwartz submitted a letter to the editor of Physics Today. And he was recruiting physicists to express their opposition to the Vietnam War. And the editors of Physics Today rejected his letter for publication. They cited its failure to address, quote, physics as physics and physicists as physicists. In other words, not appropriate for the journal Physics Today because it wasn't really about physics. And Charles Schwartz interpreted this action as a kind of political censorship. And he responded by circulating a petition to amend the Physical Society's constitution so that with at least the support of 1% of the membership, any matter of concern to the society could be brought before the entire organization for a vote. And the results of this vote, if publicized, could constitute an official organizational statement. So this could be the APS weighing in on all sorts of matters, including politics or US foreign policy. And at the time, Schwartz got 248 signatures for his petition in an organization that had over 24,000 members. And even though his effort was unsuccessful to change the Constitution, his actions provoked a firestorm of arguments within the American Physical Society. A tempest in the APS teapot that drew outside criticism and even press coverage. And I open with this moment, and I'll return to it later in the talk, because I think it cuts to the heart of an interesting tension within the American Physical Society a tension affecting American physics in general since the end of World War II. And it's this tension between the idea of physics for physics' sake, a vision of science as pure, objective, neutral, and detached, versus the contentious politics and ethics of Cold War science and the messy context in which physics as a field of study takes place, the social, political, economic, and even military context shaping physics research and in turn being shaped by physics research. And so what I'd like to do in my talk today is discuss how physicists, and particularly members of the American Physical Society, have themselves thought about this tension over time. And this is connected to my area of research, which is ethics and science, or I would say ethics and scientists. How do scientists themselves think about the ethics of what they do and the ethical obligations of individuals, or in this case, organizations? Ethics often gets discussed in the abstract, through trolley problems or other hypothetical scenarios. But I'm a historian, I'm not a philosopher, and historians are very sensitive to the complexity and messiness of real life events. So specifically, I'm going to talk about the American Physical Society during three moments within the Cold War. First, very briefly, the 1950s, and then the Vietnam War era, and then finally the Reagan years. And then I'll close by reflecting on some of the themes and questions relevant to today's set of contemporary science problems. And I hope along the way to give kind of a broad historian's take on the history of the APS and the history of the Cold War in terms of science and activism. Okay, so if we go back to the dawn of the Cold War, maybe the pre-dawn, we can see that many of the famous physicists who would later work on the Manhattan Project tended to be people who had been drawn to their work arguably because of their interest in physics as physics. That is to say, they were interested in understanding the workings of the nucleus of an atom. And while they may have been attracted to physics for many reasons, as a source of income, social and cultural prestige, intellectual excitement, they likely didn't anticipate that their many hours of theorizing and calculating in the 1910s and 20s would decades later land them in a meeting with the President of the United States or an interview on a not yet existent national television network in the 1950s. But for this generation of physicists, the power and the significance of their work became overwhelmingly apparent with the Manhattan Project. And some of this history may be quite familiar. For many of these Manhattan Project physicists, the development of the atomic bomb created what felt to them like a special burden of ethical responsibility. They believed that because physicists had created the atomic bomb, physicists bore a special ethical burden. And for those scientists who felt this ethical activist calling, one pathway to redemption lay in political action. Maybe redemption is too strong a word. But there's certainly this sense of obligation. And after the war, for example, a small but prestigious group of scientists lobbied to establish international control of nuclear energy and to promote arms control. And they founded organizations like the Federation of the Atomic Scientists, later renamed the Federation of American Scientists, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, for example, famous for its how many minutes to midnight clock. And the outward commitment of the Manhattan Project veterans to the cause of arms control was quite widespread. Even the hawkish Edward Teller, who was instrumental in developing the hydrogen bomb, he served on the board of sponsors of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, warning of the dangers of nuclear warfare. And in the years after World War II, and particularly after the launch of Sputnik, many of these scientists were also able to advocate for their political goals directly as government advisors. In 1957, for example, President Eisenhower announced the creation of the President's Science Advisory Committee, which included an extraordinary collection of the nation's top physicists, Hans Bethe, Edward Purcell, I. Rabi, all Nobel laureates in physics, Livermore director Herbert York, and many others with similarly prestigious pedigrees. And many of these physicists were also outright advocates of arms control. they saw their government service as a way to exert at least a moderating influence on US nuclear policy and the Cold War arms race. And this was especially true among the presidential science advisors. But it's also worth noting, physicists in this era ended up ensconced in government and military advisory positions, just as new weapons systems were being developed, and massive amounts of defense money was flowing into science education and research. Meanwhile, so that's inside the government. And meanwhile, outside the government, there's this overlapping contingent of physicists who are involved in powerful activist movements, the Federation of the American Scientists, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, who began endorsing a nuclear test ban. They were joined by the new National Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy, and many of the science advisors offering counselors to President Eisenhower and Kennedy were also advocating for some of these measures. Okay, so just to sum up here, in the aftermath of the atomic bomb and through the era of Sputnik in the 1950s, we see the rise and perhaps the cementing of what many historians have identified as big science, capital B, big, capital S science. And this existed in the larger context of what Eisenhower famously described as the military-industrial complex. But we also see new forms of science activism. So within government, scientists playing powerful roles as advisors, and outside governments playing roles as advocates. Okay, so what does any of this have to do with the American Physical Society? Where does APS fit in all of this? Well, these overlapping groups of science advisors and science activists were also largely academic physicists and APS members, and they participated in part-time or sometimes even full-time government service or activist work, often while maintaining their academic positions. And they considered this national service and their involvement in issues of national security to be part of their obligations as scientists. But they didn't view the American Physical Society as the best means to promote their political goals. Many APS members were involved in government and military service or outside activism, but they weren't working specifically through APS channels. And back in the 1940s, the American Institute of Physics, that's kind of the parent organization of the American Physical Society, defined its purpose as the advancement and diffusion of the knowledge of physics and its application to human welfare. So human welfare was in there. It wasn't that the APS saw itself as existing in a vacuum. And APS meetings included very thoughtful discussions of politics and ethics. The AIP acknowledged that matters of concern to physicists included everything from, quote, the problem of raising high school standards in mathematics to that of contribution to World Organization for Peace. And certainly Physics Today ran articles and book reviews that touched on topics of nuclear weapons, disarmament, and science policy more broadly. But leaders believed that the political role of the AIP should be somewhat circumscribed. To quote from an annual report from the late 1940s, AIP physicists, quote, should be ready to contribute information and advice to Washington, but, quote, as far as possible, such work should be done through government organizations rather than through the AIP. And that sentiment was echoed in an APS address by Alan Aston, the president of the Bureau of Standards in 1957, which was later reprinted in Physics Today. And he said, the greatest contribution that scientists individually or collectively can make to the public good is to do well their work as professional scientists. Be a good scientist, and that will be acting in the public good. And Aston emphasized that professional scientists, societies rather, like the APS, could serve the public good by communicating the results and significance of scientific research, and that's about it. Beyond that, if an individual scientist wanted, felt a larger sense of public responsibility, that individual scientist could take on government service work separate from the AIP. And so that language also suggests that in terms of self-perception, APS leaders saw their organization if not an entirely neutral party in Cold War America, somehow more neutral than an advisory body like the President's Science Advisory Committee or an activist organization like the Federation of American Scientists. The APS in this era saw itself as something different, a professional society, an organization devoted to that classic idea as a physics for physics' sake. So that's part one, the self-perception of the APS during the early Cold War years. But now I want to move ahead to the 1960s, the era of the Vietnam War. By the 1960s, this perception, this characterization was under attack. Critics in the 1960s argued, critics like Charles Schwartz, for example, argued, first of all, that the APS was not a neutral organization. First. Second, it never had been a neutral organization. And third, it shouldn't try to be a neutral organization, which was another way of saying there's no such thing as physics for physics' sake solely in the context of the Cold War. And so now we return to Charles Schwartz's amendment, his call to enable the APS to make official, explicitly political statements. So I mentioned that Schwartz gathered 248 signatures in an organization of over 24,000. But his actions provoked a passionate internal argument within the APS. Letters poured into Physics Today, opining on this proposal. And at a rate of more than 4-1, they vehemently opposed the amendment. And most of the critics focused on the problem of neutrality. If the Schwartz Amendment passed, would the American Physical Society become politicized? And in a mundane sense, could it lose its tax-exempt status? Would the addition of political issues detract from the organization's ability to promote scientific objectives? And these critics warned of the damaging effects of politics on the purity and the professionalism of their organization. They worried that change would, quote, jeopardize the purely scientific nature of APS. That word pure gets used a lot. They worried that it would, quote, contaminate physics with politics. So for example, Frederick Seitz, the former head of the National Academy of Sciences, worried that adding political discussion to APS journals, for example, would damage their, quote, essentially professional character. Even an anti-war activist like the mathematician Eugene Salatin of Northeastern University agreed that, quote, APS should remain pure. Again, that word pure. Edward Teller argued that APS ought to relegate public issues to, quote, traditional channels, let the science advisors take on these issues. And David McCall of Bell Labs summed up this general criticism in a simple declarative sentence. The APS is not a political instrument. And this entreaty to remain pure assumed that the society's reluctance to issue political statements constituted a kind of neutrality. If you don't say anything about an issue, you're being neutral. But was the APS pure? Was it neutral? What do these words even mean? Charles Schwartz argued that the APS was not a neutral organization. So for example, he pointed out that the APS had invited Lyndon Johnson to an annual meeting and then published a photograph of the president with APS head Charles Towns. And there you can see that image. And in Schwartz's view, this photograph itself constituted, quote, a legitimization of Lyndon Johnson's Vietnam War policies by the entire APS membership. And if that kind of legitimization was allowed, then surely APS members should be able to register their opposition as well. The future Nobel Prize winner Martin Pearl of Stanford took this argument even further at the time, arguing that even if the APS said nothing, quote, Silence is not nonpartisan. Silence supports the war, and that is a sad silence. So in the final tally, APS members overwhelmingly voted against Charles Schwartz's amendment by a margin of 3-1. But maybe more tellingly, out of an organization with over 24,000 members, roughly half participated in the amendment vote, which is, I would say, a high amount of participation for this type of thing. So I think it's clear that Schwartz's initiative here had clearly struck a nerve. People are really trying to grapple with these questions. And even though this amendment failed, it had two very interesting consequences for the APS. It led directly to the creation of two new organizations. The first was the APS Forum on Physics and Society, an APS group devoted to educational outreach and at least internal discussions of science-related policy issues, such as arms control, energy policy, and government advising. And the second organization was founded by Charles Schwartz himself, originally called Scientists for Social and Political Action, soon to incorporate engineers and be renamed with the acronym CESPA, and later renamed Science for the People. And this existed wholly outside the purview of the American Physical Society. And here you can see one of the early issues of the newsletter of the Forum on Physics and Society, and what later became the magazine Science for the People, formed by CESPA. The goal of CESPA was radical change, a dismantling of the military-industrial networks that shaped the profession. And CESPA members hoped that their organization would shake up what they saw as the elderly APS Executive Council, and would force the old guard to, quote, come out of their ivory towers and bomb shelters. And I'll just add a note about the forum here. I was very lucky when I first moved out to California to teach at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo, to meet David Hafmeister, who was a tireless and active force within the APS Forum on Physics and Society for many years. I know he was very proud of the forum's countless publications, talks, and meeting sessions in later decades. So that's the forum. But as for CESPA, this faction in the 1970s, so working outside of the APS, went on to lead the charge against weapons research on university campuses. They lobbied against the deployment of an anti-ballistic missile system, as did many non-CESPA physicists. They organized a non-participation pledge for war research. They promoted a kind of Hippocratic oath for scientists. They saw another unsuccessful amendment attempt, this time to try to include stronger moral language into the APS Constitution. And the coalition within CESPA began to fracture during the 1970s. The Boston area chapter remade itself into the more radical Science for the People, and continued their activism through the 1980s. Interestingly, a little over a decade ago, Science for the People reconstituted itself, now with a multi-generational membership, including some of its original organizers. So on the left is a collected volume of articles from Science for the People, and on the right, their more recent publication. Okay, that's all a snapshot of the APS in the Vietnam War era, late 60s, early 70s. And it's worth pointing out that physicists were just one group among many scientists grappling with the problem of professional neutrality in the late 1960s and early 1970s. From 1969 through 1972, protests and confrontations disrupted the national meetings of nearly all the major scientific professional societies in the United States. But for the most part, these new left critiques didn't yield the deep institutional change that they sought. The APS did not radically remake its constitution, for example. But I want to pause here now and jump ahead to a third moment during the 1980s, later in the Cold War, the Reagan era. Okay, So we can jump in March of 1983, when Ronald Reagan proposed the Strategic Defense Initiative, the development of a new kind of anti-ballistic missile system, a defensive shield that would be composed of ground-based and space-based interceptors, designed to protect the United States from a nuclear attack. Nicknamed SDI or Star Wars, I think Return of the Jedi came out in 1983. Billions of dollars of research money was up for grabs to create a system that would replace mutually assured destruction that had been the nuclear posture of the United States, with the premise of effective defense and survivability, at least in theory. That's what Reagan hoped. And what's fascinating is that the reaction of the scientific community to Reagan's proposed Strategic Defense Initiative was harsh and far-reaching. And arguably, the revolt against the Strategic Defense Initiative was arguably a turning point in the history of science activism, in large part because so many scientists, including those who worked on nuclear weapons research, came to oppose it, or at the very least, deeply and very publicly doubt its chances of success. Just as an example, and there was a poll in 1986 conducted by the National Academy of Sciences that found that of over 450 members who were employed in fields relevant to the Strategic Defense Initiative, over 80% opposed it. SDI led thousands of scientists to sign statements refusing SDI contracts. It resulted in the resignations of key government advisors. And unlike the agonizing debates during the war in Vietnam, SDI elicited clear public condemnations from professional organizations, from university presidents, even Livermore employees. And the response of the American Physical Society was quite different from its earlier claims to neutrality. In particular, the 1987 APS own American Physical Society's own report on directed energy weapons and a pair of explicitly political statements reveal new approaches to activism, I think, that owed at least a small debt to the controversies of the Vietnam War years. The actions of the APS in the 1980s reveal the evolution of the society's understanding of its own ethical obligations. So something to note is that the APS of the 1980s was no longer wholly dominated by the old guard of Frederick Seitz and other objectors to political activity. That new left generation had come of age. And some of the older physicists who had rejected anti-Vietnam War activism had softened their views a bit. In addition, through the 1970s, the influence of the APS Forum on Physics and Society had grown, particularly in its efforts to educate physicists about arms control. And I think all of these things contributed to the fact that by the early 1980s, APS leaders were prepared to take somewhat bolder political action. So in 1983, the APS Council issued a strong public statement arguing that because a general nuclear war could destroy civilization, the United States and the Soviet Union should pursue arms control measures without preconditions and with a sense of urgency. And I think that the evolution of this political commitment within APS, combined with the historic link between physicists and support for arms control, positioned the organization to take a stronger stance in the SDI debate than it had during the Vietnam War. Okay, so in the aftermath of Reagan's March 1983 speech, APS President Robert Marshak proposed the idea of an unclassified APS arms control study in order to raise the level of public debate. And the key topic would be directed energy weapons, the space-based technologies that would harness the power of a nuclear explosion to target and destroy incoming nuclear warheads. And this is what the report looked like in 1987. The report itself was studiously technical, and critiquing SDI solely on technical grounds might seem reasonably within that 1950s APS self-perception, physicists opining on the physics. But as the report was being drafted in the winter of 1985, Cornell physicist J. O'Rear proposed that the APS Council issue a separate public statement opposing SDI outright. And O'Rear was a former chairman of the Federation of American Scientists. He had been a vocal supporter of Charles Schwartz's ill-fated 1960s campaign to encourage political statements. And now O'Rear argued that Star Wars was a, quote, scientific hoax, and that it was important for the president to see that, quote, the organization which represents all the American physicists is strongly opposed. So O'Rear's proposal now to issue an SDI statement of opposition, an APS statement of opposition to SDI sparked another internal debate within APS. But this one was far more muted and less vitriolic than its Vietnam era counterpart. O'Rear's colleagues questioned the wording and the timing of his proposed statement. They worried that issuing a political statement before the release of the directed energy weapon study might suggest that the Physical Society had made up its mind before it undertook the study. And many forum members argued against the statement, preferring actions by individuals as opposed to resolutions by societies. But in this case, J. O'Rear successfully persuaded the council to approve a public statement on SDI. The vote wasn't unanimous, but it passed. And the final language was attached to the executive summary of the DEW report. And the report itself offered a damning technical assessment. The council's additional statement reiterated the technical concerns of the study, but it also drew on powerful moral arguments. The stakes of nuclear war included, quote, human suffering and death far beyond that ever before seen on this planet. And therefore, the United States must not deploy SDI. And the council defended this additional moral claim and political statement by asserting that they had, quote, a public responsibility to express concerns that go beyond the issues of DEW covered in the study. So in other words, the APS had obligations beyond physics as physics. Okay, so that's something different. That looks different from the Vietnam War era. But the story of the DEW study in the 1980s doesn't end here with the release of the report. The month after the report's release, former APS and National Academy of Sciences President Frederick Seitz and the Livermore physicist Lowell Wood attacked the APS report in front of Republican members of Congress. And Lowell Wood was a pioneer in the applications of laser and computer technology to missile defense. And by the 1980s, he reflected a kind of conservative mirror image of those older New Left critiques of science and neutrality. The New Left had argued scientists are not neutral, they exist in a larger context. Well, now Lowell Wood, arguing kind of from the right, argued that APS scientists were not disinterested, they were not dispassionate seekers of truth, they were politicized as evidenced by this report, and they were motivated by crass impulses, by competition, peer esteem, prizes and recognition. I'm quoting from Lowell Wood directly there. As a side note, for people interested in the social construction of science, this is language right out of Bruno Latour, who's writing about this in the same time period. But even more so than Lowell Wood, Frederick Seitz embodied this conservative attack on scientific credibility. And Seitz was a Manhattan Project veteran who had retired from academic research in 1979, had spent years defending R.J. Reynolds from tobacco regulation, and had been promoting expanded nuclear weapons development. I know both of these men attacked the APS report as riddled with errors, unreasonably pessimistic, and heavily politicized. The APS leadership was furious. They countered that Seitz was the one who was corrupt. He was the chairman of the Pentagon's SDI Advisory Committee. He stood to benefit financially from the program. And they argued that it was the APS who could be truly independent because they were not the consumers of the technology in question. And this all, I think, was a fascinating way to try to reconcile the polarized arguments from the 1960s. The APS was objective, even if its statements were not neutral. The APS was issuing political statements, but their study of the DEW was objective. That's the argument that APS leadership was making: objective, but not necessarily neutral. Okay, so all of this raises, I think, some interesting questions. What accounts for this shift within the American Physical Society? I think this development reflects the culmination of multiple Cold War trends in ethical thinking among scientists. First, the historical affinity of scientists, especially physicists, for arms control, seen in the 1950s and 60s in physicists' work to promote arms control and a nuclear test ban, in the 1960s and 70s to promote an anti-ballistic missile system, and then in the 1970s and 80s in the growing nuclear freeze movement. That tendency was there, maybe sometimes outside of the APS purview. But second, an evolving view of appropriate political behavior by scientists. I mentioned the generational shifts within the APS, the work of the Forum through the 1970s. But there's also some relevant political history here, including President Nixon's decision in 1973 to dismantle the entire presidential science advising system, eliminating both the Presidential Science Advisory Committee and the Office of Science and Technology in favor of much weaker advisory mechanisms. And so there's a kind of Sputnik boom and Vietnam War era bust, the old Sputnik advising order that starts to fall apart in the 1970s. In that old Sputnik system, there had been this generation of elite iconoclastic scientists providing influential expertise and policy guidance to political leaders. And now these elite scientists had fewer direct advisory channels available. They had to seek alternate means to influence policy. As Henry Kendall of the Union of Concerned Scientists observed in the 1980s, in that decade, many scientists feel more estranged from government. And I think this estrangement and alienation helps explain why physicists who had maybe balked at earlier moments of science activism now joined the anti-SDI movement. And perhaps why elite scientists within the APS were more open to using their organization to influence policy. And the results of these shifts is that by 1988, that harsh report of the American Physical Society had been published and well publicized, and other academic organizations and professional organizations, like, for example, the American Mathematical Society, were taking stands not to participate in activities that could be interpreted as supporting SDI. So professional organizations that in 1969 had fought tooth and nail to avoid public political statements regarding the Vietnam War now leapt headfirst into the political controversies of SDI. But what about the general problem of professional neutrality, the tension between physics for physics' sake and Cold War politics? This is a bit trickier. In the 1980s, professional organizations such as the APS and the American Mathematical Society claimed both objectivity and political obligations simultaneously, drawing on their own prestige to boost the case against SDI. And then in turn, the handful of scientists who endorsed SDI picked up on these, what they saw as inconsistencies, which they kind of revealing a cynical application maybe of the New Left arguments originally intended to force scientists to confront their complicity in the Vietnam War. Now conservative supporters of Star Wars, such as Teller and Seitz, portrayed APS physicists as politicized agents in order to discredit their technical as well as moral claims about SDI. And by attacking the objectivity of scientists, they could attack the legitimacy of scientific consensus and scientific authority. And recently, science historians and journalists have demonstrated just how effective these kinds of actions by so-called merchants of doubt have been. The book Merchants of Doubt by Eric Conway and Naomi Oreskes is a prime example. I don't think that Edward Teller would have said in the 1980s that he was influenced by New Left arguments in the 60s and 70s. But he and others nevertheless took some of those critiques of neutrality in order to selectively politicize and discredit policies that they opposed that were supported by large majorities of scientists. Okay, I'm reaching the end here, I promise. This raises a big question then. How should physicists think about and act on their ethical and political obligations? And what role should an organization like the American Physical Society play? I'm a historian. I'm not in a position to comment on some of the recent internal debates within the APS, but I know these are not dead questions. Whether it's the APS commenting on the war in Ukraine or Israel and Gaza or weapons defense systems. And I don't think there's a simple answer to these questions. Unfortunately, I think in physics, researchers often look for simplicity, for the elegant solution. And in my discipline of history, researchers somehow seem to always be striving to complicate the narrative. But I will note that what history tells us here is that there's a substantial legacy of the American Physical Society actively and seriously debating these questions. And there's a history of evolution and change over time. The APS is not a static, unchanging organization. And we can see that in the evolution of the APS mission statement. Here's one from 2009. Here's a more recent one. Here I've kind of juxtaposed them. The APS is not static. It's an organization that evolves. And so I predict that physicists will continue to grapple with these questions in new ways as they have been all along. I don't know, maybe in some way the talks in this APS history webinar series can perhaps help us in this quest. And so that's the end of my formal remarks. I'm happy to address questions. I don't know how easy it is to have a larger discussion with members in the audience, maybe talking to each other, but I'm happy to see where the discussion goes. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sarah. We'll open it up for questions now. You can either use the little raise hand function there at the bottom of the screen and have your say that way. Or you can write something in the chat and I will be happy to read the questions out from those. Join in there, anybody. Sarah, I'll start it off myself by asking to, I thought it was interesting you were talking about the criticisms of SDI on really partly on technical grounds. And it seemed that quite a few of the critics were saying, this wouldn't work. It just wouldn't work on its own terms. Whereas others were saying, even if it did work, it's a bad thing. It would make more of a temptation to launch a nuclear attack and that sort of thing. How did that break out? Were there people who were saying both, or was it mostly one or mostly the other?
It's both of those things. It's really quite interesting. So a lot of the arguments against SDI, some of them harken back to the arguments against an anti-ballistic missile system going back in the 60s, that, it's a system that has to work perfectly, otherwise it's not useful. And so, if there's any kind of computing glitch, or somebody sends over a whole bunch of decoy missiles that overwhelm the system, then it's not going to work. A lot of the proposed technology hadn't yet been developed. So the idea was, well, we could develop this whole command and control system and all of these detectors and all of this,
Mhm.
and so there are a number of scientists who just didn't see feasibly that this could work. But the other issue, this is really interesting in looking at Livermore employees, for example,
Yeah.
who are working on nuclear weapons research, who opposed SDI, that it undermined mutually assured destruction, the premise of
Mhm.
mutually assured destruction. If you suggest that the United States wouldn't be destroyed in a nuclear war, that destabilizes the nuclear posture. And for
Mhm.
a lot of physicists who worked on these nuclear weapon systems, and their kind of moral understanding of what they were doing is, we're building these weapons so that they won't ever be used. We're
Mhm.
building this deterrent force. And of course, there's critics of that viewpoint within the
Yeah.
physics community. But that's an argument where you can have actual nuclear weapons engineers. And in many cases, some of these people did did have SDI contracts, even though when they were asked about it, they said, we don't think this is going to
Yeah.
work.
I saw that myself, I have to say, of people I knew at the time. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was actually pretty common. And there are lots of spin-off technologies that come out of. There's a whole lot of other things to discuss about SDI. But in terms of people being skeptical that it would work and opposed to it on political and even moral grounds, I think those arguments ended up overlapping. You could get the same group of people, in different contexts addressing all of those concerns.
Okay. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A here. Um, I'll just read them out so everybody can hear. Cheryl Spencer, there was another constitutional amendment about 10 years ago, and now members at large do not get to vote on any APS constitutional amendments. Only the council members get to propose and vote on constitutional amendments. Has Dr. Bridger looked at this more recent history?
Yeah, so most of my research is really on this Cold War era. I think, as I mentioned, I know that these disputes and debates have come up within APS over the past decade or so. Um, I don't have an insider's knowledge. I'm not privy to all of the discussions that took place there. In part, I was kind of curious to know of the people in the audience who might have some insight
Well,
into the politics of these
as,
discussions, if anyone
as
wanted
may,
to
may
weigh
see on the
in.
Q&A, Cheryl Spencer adds, I
Yeah.
led the no vote against that constitutional amendment with Bert Richter. So happy to hear more from Cheryl Spencer on that, perhaps a little later. Dylan Spalding writes, it seems that sometimes physicists may use the guise of objectivity as a convenient means of avoiding uncomfortable topics, or our scientific training imparts a sense that we are not sufficiently expert to weigh in. I think that's an important point of people taking a view that you have to be absolute expert to say anything. Can you address examples where you think scientists were simply afraid to engage in ethical issues? Do you see other reasons they might avoid engaging?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's common, and that's not exclusive to scientists
Mhm.
either. You know, this talk was about the American Physical Society, but there are very similar debates happening in other professional societies, and on university campuses during the Vietnam War. Something that's really interesting at Princeton, for example, there are a wave of student protests at MIT, at Columbia, at Princeton, um, in which students demanded that university administrations, sever ties with the Defense Department, kick classified research off campus. And I think a lot of university administrators were very nervous about kind of figuring out what sort of policy would be appropriate. In some cases, maybe that's nervousness about sticking their neck out in terms of making political statements. There's also sometimes a lot of money at stake. That's another example of, scientists not wanting to step out and make a controversial political statement. Well, what happens if their funding dries up, or they lose security
Mhm.
clearances? That all of these issues can be
Mhm.
factors. And so, I think that there are a lot of debates within the APS during the Vietnam War era, and people who are opposed to the Vietnam War but didn't feel comfortable. They wanted the APS to have it to be outside of those debates. They wanted it to be what they considered pure. And then, of course, as critics pointed out, what is it? Is it possible to be pure and a physicist in the Cold War United States? But that sense of I don't know, maybe finding some sort of safety in the idea of the APS as neutral, even while people in other contexts might stick their neck out. I don't know. I'm rambling a little bit in answer to this question, but I think that there are lots of examples of scientists not wanting to stick their neck out politically. And then there's also lots of cases where people may not have been sure what they thought about a particular political issue. And that's, I think with us now, there are all kinds of topics that people may have a vague sense about, but not sure they're expert enough to make a public statement about.
I think the next question from Jacob Robertson sort of touches on a related issue. He says, large membership organizations like APS will always be constrained by consensus-driven processes. Is there a role for APS to play in simply connecting members to other activism channels that are less constrained? Or are there historical examples of APS practicing this connecting role in a formal way? And I think maybe FPS might be an example of that.
Yeah, I think these kind of internal groups within APS that are intended to bring members together to talk about political issues that can in turn connect people. I was at an APS conference maybe 10 years ago or so on a panel with a similar theme in which speakers were talking about APS efforts to reach out to physicists in the Soviet Union and to help people leave who wanted to get out. And there was a lot about the forum and work that had been done by people who are APS members, kind of working with other organizations. And the APS had facilitated that, which is not quite the same as, making a formal public statement that's supposed to reflect the entire membership. So I think that kind of work has absolutely gone on, through some of these internal groups that are helping, connect people to each other and then connect them to outside efforts.
Robert Biedenhansel says, I skipped over Mark Goodman. Mark Goodman, how does the treatment of Oppenheimer, the revocation of a security clearance, fit the narrative of politicizing science advising? It seems like an important case, certainly one that's gotten a lot of attention in recent years, an important case that predates the APS history that you've presented here.
I think, lots of scientists were highly critical of that decision. Here again, that world of the 1950s, there's a lot to say about the Oppenheimer case. I think Oppenheimer, like many of the targets of McCarthyism in general, people who got in trouble for their, political views back in the 1930s and during World War II, is then having those kind of dredged up. Oppenheimer had been skeptical of the hydrogen bomb project. There's lots of other issues coming to play there. I think maybe a better way to approach it is to say there's a separate question of kind of the function of government science advisors in the 1950s. I mentioned that there are lots of members of the Presidential Science Advisory Committee who are being asked to weigh in on, should we develop this or that weapons system? Should we, put money into this area of weapons research? And I think they saw themselves as potentially playing a moderating force or having, kind of a moderating effect. Some of them outside of their PSAC work were ardent advocates for disarmament, had kind of much stronger views. And there's a whole interesting story there of kind of the mix between giving a technical evaluation of something and then offering, political advice. That's true in the, debates over having a nuclear test ban, for example. So, I think maybe Oppenheimer reflects something about that. What happens if you're outspoken criticizing a particular weapon system that other people in power really want to develop? That creates some problems. And it's kind of convenient that Oppenheimer had these, had been a fellow traveler back in the 1930s and 40s. So that's harmful. I don't know that, though, that kind of debate, I don't know enough about kind of what type of internal anti-communist efforts within the APS were kind of paralleling that effort. Yeah, I really can't speak to that. It's possible that there's something, there are other efforts within the APS, but I don't know enough about that topic to comment. I don't know if Bruce, you have any comments there.
Not directly. There's certainly been a lot said and written about the Oppenheimer case, and it is, I think, on the H-bomb debate, I think there's an interesting, back and forth between technical judgment that it was simply there wasn't a workable design, and you didn't want to put all these resources into it. And Oppenheimer clearly is taking that view in the early stages of it, in the famous GAC report in 1949, versus the sort of this is a morally reprehensible weapon that should never be developed. And I don't think those are cleanly separated, and for Oppenheimer himself or for many of the other people involved. A couple of other questions here. Robert Fiedenhansel, very exciting talk. Can you extrapolate the Cold War history into today, where we discuss if or how to collaborate with Russia and China? How can or should organizations like the APS position themselves? Always awkward to ask an historian to extrapolate to today, but we're asking.
Yeah, I'm good at looking backwards, not so much forwards. Well, speaking more broadly, I mentioned, earlier APS efforts to try to, help dissident physicists in the Soviet Union, for example. But it is kind of a fascinating aspect of science, and physics has a long history of this, of physicists during the Cold War having almost a kind of some special entry points into collaboration and communication and engagement with scientists around the world, including with the Soviet Union. There's a history of the pugwash movement, for example, that included a lot of physicists in the Soviet Union and the US actually getting together and meet with each other, having conferences, and kind of ostensibly trying to use engagement to promote arms control. But I think the international character of scientific research affords some opportunities, but they do get into again, this tricky question. Is it, what's reasonable in terms of engaging with scientists who work in a country that maybe has a hostile government or a repressive government? All of these questions come up in different capacities. And in the Cold War, they're all sort of along Cold War anti-communist lines. But I think the principles there are still around. And yeah, I don't know if that's a clear answer to your question, other than to say that there is a precedent, I think, for scientists in countries that have very radical, different, political regimes in place, trying to find ways to communicate, and even using that communication as a tool to, improve international relations.
Yeah. We have another question on something I think you've also written about. Where do the Jasons fit into the narrative of involvement of physicists in defense research and political activism?
Yeah.
The Jasons are always fun to.
Yeah. I have a chapter in my book about the Jasons. I think they very much embody this sense. The origins of the Jasons go back to that late 1950s post-Sputnik period, of scientists who felt like it was their patriotic duty to advise the federal government, to use their expertise. A lot of the initial cohort of Jasons, they were a bit younger sometimes than the Manhattan Project generation, and often very committed to arms control. And they saw their work with the Jasons initially as, here are ways we could try to develop detection techniques to help enforce a nuclear test ban, or, they had this sense of arms control, like this could be a tool to promote arms control. But like the Presidential Science Advising Committee, what ended up happening is that the Jasons and all these other science advisors ended up ensconced at like all levels of government and military advising, just as the Vietnam War got underway. And the Jasons are an example of I think scientists who got involved for one reason and then sort of found themselves by the 1960s, instead of being asked to work on, could we enforce a nuclear test ban, they're being asked to develop, counterinsurgency, evaluate counterinsurgency technologies for use in jungle warfare, whatever, with obvious applications. And that created, I think, for the Jasons themselves, some internal angst about whether they should be doing this. The Jasons ended up trying to find a technical solution to the Vietnam War by creating this electronic barrier with sensors that they thought would prevent, supplies going from north to south. It was never fully implemented, but to the extent that it was implemented in a way that was the opposite of what they wanted. They wanted de-escalation. It got implemented in ways that escalated the war. But to bring things back to activism, some of the work of the Jasons in the 60s got released as part of the Pentagon Papers. And again, like many of the physicists I'm talking about, they had kind of both academic positions and were doing this science advisory work. So a lot of these Jasons found like their undergraduate and graduate advisees found out about the work that their professors were doing as advisors, and were totally opposed to it, argued that the Jasons were basically war criminals. They were working on technologies used in the Vietnam War, which there was opposition to. I think there was one critic on, I think it was on the MIT campus, who described the Jasons as well-meaning war criminals. Anyway, just kind of, this is kind of the most extreme way of bringing together all of these efforts of scientists trying to do government advising work, thinking of themselves as maybe neutral or objective, or evaluating the technologies involved. And for this younger new left generation, all of those intentions don't matter. You're part of the military industrial complex. You can't extract yourself from it. Or if you can't extract yourself from it, then you're part of this war machine. And so you get really, vitriolic rhetoric in the 60s and 70s. Of course, later on, the Jasons ended up working on, climate change technologies, all sorts of other work that's not explicitly weapons related. And I think the Jason program itself was basically terminated by the Trump administration. I don't know if it's been resuscitated in some capacity since then. I don't know if that totally answers the question. I think the Jasons reflect a lot of these
Yeah,
things.
there's a lot to it. Any further questions? If not, I think we'll thank Sarah for a very interesting talk, and the group for some interesting questions. This will be recorded, as I understand it, and will be posted by APS in some suitable place in the future. So if you enjoyed the talk and want to refer some friends to it, tell them it'll be available later. Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you to the audience. And we'll end it now. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.